I used to think my life was a tragedy, but now I realize it's a comedy.
Powerful words, Mark. From our subject for today, Arthur Fleck, the lead character from the hit movie Joker.
Although it's a fictional world, the sentiments that Arthur expresses are reality to many. So let's try to understand, who is Arthur Fleck?
And also, why is his life riddled with mental health struggles and societal neglect, viewed as a comedy?
But above all, what truly defines a person's state of sanity? Is it the way Arthur perceives his own life or the societal norms that push him into believing his life is a tragedy?
Setting the stage for an unsettling yet profound discussion, folks.
Let's delve into Arthur Fleck's past. His childhood wasn't a walk in the park, was it, Zoe?
Far from it, Mark. His early years were filled with neglect and abuse, shaping his mannerisms, behaviors, and perceptions of the world.
Yes, awful as it is. But it's important to understand how his upbringing led to his complicated mental health status.
In the movie, we learn that Arthur was subjected to horrific abuse from his mother's boyfriend, leading to a traumatic brain injury. He was kept in a deplorable environment, devoid of love, guidance, or even basic care.
The way the movie illustrates this is downright heart-wrenching. His mother, someone who should have been Arthur's protector, instead turned a blind eye, worsening the psychological impact on young Arthur.
It's a classic example of the adverse effects of childhood maltreatment. Abuse, neglect, consistent exposure to traumatic situations during one's formative years can have severe cognitive, emotional, and social consequences.
A study by the American Psychological Association suggests that such children are prone to a host of psychiatric problems in adulthood, including personality disorders. Arthur's hallucinations and his delusional disorder could stem from this early mistreatment, right?
That's a fair speculation, Mark. A direct link between childhood trauma and mental health problems in adulthood is well documented in psychological research. In Arthur's case, it catalyzes his already complex mental health issues, inevitably playing a large role in his descent into what we later come to know as the Joker.
Mom, you're the only one that's ever been nice to me. Arthur's words, Zoe. Let's talk about this relationship's impact.
There's a lot to unpack here. Arthur's relationship with his mother, Penny, is complex and deeply dysfunctional. His attachment to Penny, which in a healthy context should have offered safety and comfort, instead served as a constant source of distress.
That disruption in the secure base is a noteworthy concept in psychology, particularly among studies of early life attachment. Every child needs that protective entity, don't they?
Exactly, Mark. It's a fundamental necessity. When children grow up without this secure base, it can lead to significant emotional and psychological difficulties. Now think of Arthur, who not only lacked this healthy attachment, but also endured abuse.
And the truth behind his mother's delusion about him being the illegitimate child of Thomas Wayne, that must have shattered his trust completely.
Certainly. This shocking revelation destabilized his existing perceptions and intensified his feelings of unease and isolation. It's this destructive relationship with his mother, a series of betrayals and denials, that forms one of the key factors driving Arthur's descent into chaos.
So a lot of Arthur's pain can be traced back to this fractured mother-son relationship, ultimately contributing to his instability. Zoe, let's discuss another facet of Arthur's character, his laugh.
Yes, Arthur's laugh. It's actually a medical condition known as pseudobulbar affect. It can cause sudden bouts of uncontrollable laughing or crying.
But it's more than just a medical condition, isn't it?
Absolutely. More than a mere symptom of his mental condition, it's symbolic of Arthur's struggle. His laughter is seldom a reflection of joy or amusement. It's almost always distressing, inappropriate, and serves to alienate him further from others. It speaks volumes about his internal turmoil.
I remember during the bus scene, his uncontrollable laughter scared the child's mother, leaving Arthur humiliated. He's trying so desperately to fit in, yet his laughter condition does the opposite.
That's right. His laughter is often met with disdain, scorn, and eventually violence. Ironically, the one thing that makes him stand out is also the thing that makes him a victim.
It's his involuntary response in high-pressure situations, right? It's almost a protective shield for him. Society fails to comprehend it, finding it disturbing and unsettling.
Yes, and it's a classic case of misunderstanding mental health symptoms. Arthur's laughter is the very embodiment of his struggle, his desperate attempt to connect with a society that ultimately misunderstands and stigmatizes him.
Moving on to how the movie depicts mental health, we see the filmmakers paint a terribly bleak picture through Arthur's unraveling.
Mark, it indeed feels that way. They show Arthur's life as one of isolation, misunderstanding, and persistent dejection. Alienated, belittled, and scorned, his story showcases tragic fallout of a societal system that rejects and marginalizes individuals like him.
Zoe, I think you've hit a core point there. The societal neglect Arthur experiences is brutal, and his mental health care, inadequate at best. From the insensitive social worker who's clearly checked out, to the cancellation of Arthur's therapy due to funding cuts. It all paints a dismaying picture of the mental health services that sadly do mirror real circumstances sometimes.
Yes, Mark. What's more, the lack of proper support system plays a significant role in Arthur's downward turn. It's a poignant reminder that mental health is often affected, or even dictated, by forces far beyond an individual's control. This could range from the degree of family support to the availability of care and social attitudes.
Talking about Arthur's support system, or the lack thereof, we see how easily he gets consumed by his mental health disorders without anyone to lean on. We don't know exactly what these disorders are, but they certainly are complex and debilitating. Zoe, in your professional exposure, could you shed some light on particular strategies that might help someone in a situation similar to Arthur's?
Mark, that's indeed a critical question. The right course of action would certainly be guided by the specific diagnosis, which remains ambiguous in Arthur's case. However, a comprehensive approach involving medication, psychotherapy, family, and community support always yields better outcomes. Conclusively, Arthur's story is a wake-up call for everyone to rethink our approaches to mental health and the systems surrounding it.
Let's now turn our spotlight onto the real villain in Arthur's life, the stigma he faces.
That's a poignant point, Mark. The shame, loneliness, and fear Arthur suffers due to stigma are not unique to him. They reflect on countless individuals grappling with mental health disorders in our society today.
Exactly, Zoe. Throughout the film, we see Arthur humiliated and cast aside. Those he reaches out to for help more often than not react with disdain and fear.
The anxious anticipation of isolation and scorn can often be as debilitating as the psychological afflictions themselves. Arthur's transformation into the Joker reflects an extreme consequence of these harmful societal attitudes.
It just proves that negative reactions and stigmatization can lead people to take drastic actions, doesn't it?
Yes, and it also underscores how our systems are failing people like Arthur. Instead of providing the right support and understanding, we as a society are pushing them to their limits.
Zoe, I can't help but wonder how different Arthur's life could have been if he hadn't faced such blatant stigma. He always wanted to bring joy and laughter into the world, a desire tragically twisted due in part to society's ostracization of him.
Absolutely, Mark. We need to remember that stigma can make psychological conditions infinitely more difficult to bear. Eliminating it requires us all to be more understanding and compassionate towards individuals battling mental health disorders.
All right, Zoe, here's a bone of contention among psychologists and non-psychologists alike. Nature versus nurture. Let's apply that to Arthur Fleck's journey into becoming the Joker. Was Arthur born destined to become the Joker, or was he fashioned into the Joker by the Gotham City's cruel circumstances?
That's an extraordinary question, Mark. Considering the traumatic childhood experiences and the neglect Arthur has faced, it paints a huge nurture component at play. His environment, filled with abuse, abandonment, and apathy, undoubtedly pushed him into a corner.
There's more to it than his upbringing and the environment that he was exposed to. His pseudo-bulbar affect, the laughter condition he had, doesn't it pull structure into the mix? Considering it's a neurological condition, likely a result of the brain trauma he suffered as a child, couldn't it suggest a genetic or biological predisposition?
I see where you're getting at, Mark. While this may be a possibility, attributing this condition to be the primary cause of his horrific transformation falls short. It would be unfair and an exaggeration to pin his antagonist metamorphosis purely on his condition.
Yes, that is an exaggeration. But these genetic susceptibilities or structural abnormalities in the brain may at least play a small part, no? Do you think it was his ill treatment and the society's reaction to his strife that created the Joker? Is it the nurture, then, that's rushed into stardom here?
You've a point here, Mark. We can't entirely rule out a combination of genetic and environmental triggers at play in Arthur's case. However, considering the societal neglect and rejection Arthur was subjected to, and how it mirrors the lived experiences of many battling mental health disorders in real life, the environment seems to have had a far greater role in shaping the Joker.
What if there was a positive influence in his life? A person who provided him with some form of sincere affection. Would that have turned his life around, or would he have still descended into becoming the Joker?
Interesting thought, Mark. Posing a hypothetical scenario like this treads into unexplored territory. It's tough to say with clarity, but the right support, love, and understanding perhaps might have redirected his journey.
Now I'd like to put Gotham City under a lens.
Indeed, Gotham City plays a crucial role in Joker.
It's beyond just a backdrop as it sort of morphs into a character in itself, doesn't it? Hosting a slew of societal problems, notably class disparity.
Absolutely. The movie stresses on the growing divide between the elite and the less affluent, which maintains a pressing tension throughout the narrative.
And Arthur, with his financial instability and fading dreams of making it into the entertainment industry, falls right at the bottom of Gotham's social ladder.
Yes, Arthur's inability to climb out of his financial troubles furthers his sense of alienation, severely crippling his self-esteem and hope.
Another aspect is the resentment for the system, especially given their cutbacks on social services. Arthur himself loses access to his medication and counselor due to such budget cuts.
This brings in another layer of neglect within the privileged class, who show just about no understanding or empathy towards those struggling.
When observing Arthur's path to becoming the Joker, one can't help but wonder if socio-economic inequality and lack of empathetic leadership are the true villains.
That's reasonable. Gotham essentially sets up an environment that breeds discontent, leading to the rise of the Joker.
From a filmmaking perspective, can we discuss some of the subtle directorial choices that indicate Arthur's psychological state?
Absolutely, Mark. There's a plethora of them. Here's what I noticed. The symbolic camera work. It's a frequently overlooked aspect but greatly contributes to storytelling. The camera seems to echo Arthur's emotional state throughout the movie. It's shaky and disjointed during his chaotic moments and calm when he is.
Interesting. I also noticed that in most scenes the camera refuses to let Arthur out of its sight, reinforcing the idea of him feeling constantly scrutinized by society.
Right. And speaking of scrutiny, I'd like to discuss the film's use of colors. Dull, washed-out colors evoke a sense of hopelessness, while the vibrantly colored parts, like Arthur's makeup, stand out drastically, mirroring his moments of transformation.
Those flashes of bright colors provide almost jarring breaks from the visually dreary Gotham, which I think also feeds into Arthur's sense of alienation.
Definitely. Let's not forget the film's score. The haunting soundtrack keeps pace with Arthur's escalating distress, crescendoing during his violent outbursts and retreating to a subtle hum during his quieter, more introspective moments.
It does. It's incredibly eerie how the music becomes an accomplice of Arthur's actions or even his psyche. It's like the film, with every aspect of its creation, has been carefully crafted to mirror Arthur's journey into madness.
Every single choice contributes to making the viewer feel deeply unsettled, as if guiding them to experience life through Arthur's broken perspective.
Joker's phenomenal success surely lies in this layered storytelling, where every element is tuned to reflect our protagonist's inner turmoil.
The immersive techniques gave us a unique inside look into the psyche of Arthur Fleck, a man undone by a society that failed him.
I used to think that my life was a tragedy, but now I realize it's a comedy. Do you remember this quote from the movie, Zoey?
Yes, it's quite striking. It reveals Arthur's distorted perception of his insignificant and oftentimes tragic life as somewhat comedic. But Mark, where would you attribute this ironic interpretation of his life to in the context of his mental health?
Well, it's as if Arthur's sanity depends upon this peculiar coping strategy. It's his way of processing the havoc surrounding him. Essentially, he masks his tragedy to the point that it bears humor. The danger, of course, is that it's a distorted humor he finds in his suffering, which is disturbing to say the least.
That's a compelling interpretation, Mark. There's another quote that comes to mind. Is it just me, or is it getting crazier out there? It demonstrated his growing confusion and distress about the world around him, a common feeling among those with severe mental health issues.
True. His sense of reality is skewed by his psychosis, but this quote also illustrates his acute awareness of a world that he finds increasingly chaotic and unkind. Unfortunately, it's a sentiment that resonates with many who feel marginalized or alienated by society.
The reality we perceive is often tinted by our personal and psychological battles, isn't it? These quotes really illustrate how Arthur's bleak perspective of the world around him played a crucial role in his transformation into Joker.
Indeed. It calls to mind the quote, "Smile because it confuses people. Smile because it's easier than explaining what is killing you inside." His alarming interpretation of happiness and despair indicates just how fragmented his psyche had become.
This tragic view of happiness again underlines his delusional belief system. It shows how Arthur was not just a damaged man, but an emblem of a failed system and an uncaring society.
Our interpretation of Arthur's character definitely varies as we bring our unique perspectives to it. Zoe, in your interactions, did you notice if people had a differing outlook on Joker?
Absolutely, Mark. From conversations with colleagues to social media discussions, I've observed a wide array of perspectives about Arthur. Some see him as a villain, some empathize with his suffering, while others view him as a symbol of a failing mental health system.
Interesting, isn't it? How a character can mean so many things to different people. It perhaps speaks about our societal attitudes towards mental health as well. If one finds Arthur threatening, it might reflect their fear or misunderstanding of mental illnesses.
That's a thoughtful point, Mark. Those who empathize with Arthur might have a more compassionate view of individuals fighting mental health battles. They see the struggle and identify the gaps in the system that did not offer enough support.
And so these varied interpretations of Arthur's character can teach us a lot about our individual biases, fears, and expectations related to mental health. It's almost as if Arthur becomes a mirror reflecting our attitudes. A fascinating thought, isn't it, Zoe?
Definitely, it offers us a chance to introspect and understand our personal views. Conversations about characters like Arthur can be instrumental in fostering a dialogue around mental health.
That's the beauty of consistent cinematic depictions like Joker. They provide a safe space for discussing real-world issues, and their variety of interpretations serve as a testament to the complexity of human psychology. So Zoe, Joaquin Phoenix's portrayal of the Joker was said to be particularly disturbing due to its psychological realism. Do you see this as well compared to other portrayals?
Absolutely, Mark. What Phoenix was able to convey through this version of Joker was a grounded, humanizing portrayal. The authenticity in the depiction of Arthur's unsettling progression into Joker definitely felt unsettling.
Right, the whole process felt realistic, complete with Arthur's heartbreaking failures, heartbreaking rejections, and the eventual eruption of his repressed anger and despair.
And it's not just about the performance. The storytelling played a part too. What set Joker apart was its unwavering exploration of an extremely misfortunate man's spiral into madness due to circumstances as much as internal chaos.
Let's discuss some other portrayals for comparison. Jack Nicholson in Tim Burton's Batman, or Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight, for instance, how did they differ?
Well, Nicholson's Joker came across as more of a gangster villain, while Ledger's was an agent of chaos. Both were comic book-style Jokers, showcasing larger-than-life, almost caricatural villains.
It almost feels like they were intended to be these mythical figures of chaos and destruction, not people with nuanced psyches, wrestling with their internal issues.
Exactly. And it was this departure from the traditional portrayal that made Phoenix's Joker so shocking. It drew us into the horrifying descent of a man grappling with serious mental health issues, under societal pressures, and often failing in his struggle.
And noticeably, while previous versions have been menacing and malicious, this one was oddly sympathetic, at least at first, wouldn't you agree?
Definitely. Phoenix played it with an unnerving vulnerability. We're shown Arthur's battles before he turns to violence, and disturbingly enough, at some level, one can see where he comes from.
It's a stark difference from the usual supervillain image. Instead, we're face-to-face with a magnified, unsettling reflection of a society's failings and an individual's struggles. That's quite a shift from the previous depictions, isn't it?
It is indeed, Mark. This complex portrayal eliciting both sympathy and dread is what sets Phoenix's Joker apart, making it a truly memorable performance.
So delving into Freudian interpretation, complex as Arthur Fleck's psyche is, we could refer to Freud's psychoanalysis, which divides our personality into the id, ego, and superego. What's your take on this, Zoe?
In the case of Arthur, his id, the instinctual component demanding immediate satisfaction, can be observed in his pain-fueled aggressive outbursts. His direct and primal expressions of anger and rebellion are showcased throughout the film.
Right. Id was giving him a hard time. And the ego operates based on the reality principle, which tries to achieve the id's desires in realistic and socially acceptable methods. It could be observed when Arthur is striving to fit into society, suffering humiliation, and holding down his job.
That's a good interpretation, Mark. Meanwhile, his superego, the moral conscience, seems severely compromised, given his increasingly violent actions. In simple terms, it's the failure of his ego and superego to mediate his id's aggressive tendencies that could be said to drive Arthur's transformation into Joker.
Remember that pivotal scene when he calls out society's hypocrisy on the talk show? Here, his id seems to overpower all constraints, resulting in brutal consequences.
Absolutely, Mark. The film illustrates Arthur's path from an individual weighed down by societal norms to someone entirely driven by his id. It's a heartbreaking manifestation of Freud's theories.
And do we see other subconscious tendencies, Zoe? Like scenes hinting at Arthur's Oedipus complex, Freud's notable theory?
His obsession with the TV show host Murray, who Arthur sees as a father figure, can be seen as an expression of his unresolved father issues. This adds yet another layer to this complex character.
Thinking about those potential therapeutic interventions for Arthur, Zoe.
Well, Mark, as a speech-language pathologist in real-life settings, I often work with a licensed therapist. First, we should acknowledge Arthur was failed by the system. He was receiving medication, but without holistic care, it wasn't enough. So I'd say, cognitive behavioral therapy could have been a suitable intervention to begin with.
CBT helps a person recognize and manage destructive thought patterns, right?
Exactly. It might have helped Arthur to channel his frustrations in a healthier way. Adequate family therapy could have played a role too, given his strong attachment to his mother.
That makes sense. Applied in time, such interventions might have at least softened Arthur's path of anger and isolation. What about the societal aspect, Zoe?
Right. We can't ignore that. Mental health issues are often layered like in Arthur's case. There was personal trauma, but also societal circumstances that worsened his condition, making him feel unvalued and misunderstood. The society must work towards being more compassionate and understanding of mental health struggles, while providing better access to comprehensive care.
Care which includes consistent, empathetic support and rehab programs beyond medication. I can't help but think how Arthur's fate might have been different if these were in place. Zoe, reflecting on Arthur's story and indeed the narrative of Joker, what do you think are the key lessons for our listeners?
Well, Mark, aside from the more apparent messages about societal neglect and inequality, I think the movie underscores the importance of empathy and kindness to those suffering. You notice when Arthur was treated with kindness, such as by his co-worker Gary, it made a difference. Mental health issues don't exist in isolation. They involve individuals and their interactions. It's a powerful takeaway.
Right, Zoe. Kindness and empathy might seem like small things but can be lifesavers for individuals facing mental health battles. Moreover, something else hits me. How society's perception has a powerful impact on self-identity. Arthur's perception of himself was much shaped by how the society perceived him, don't you think?
Absolutely, Mark. He felt overlooked, rejected, and ridiculed. You wonder how much of that despair might have been alleviated if he had been seen and valued as a fellow human being. So, for our listeners, perhaps, understanding, compassion, and validation are what we all can provide a little more of.
Very well said, Zoe. So, in summary, Joker is a hard-hitting yet poignant portrayal of humanity's need to be more understanding and compassionate towards individuals with mental health issues. That's a lesson it leaves with us.